Daniel Finkelstein is one of the most prominent voices in British politics and the media. He has advised prime ministers and was the executive editor of The Times, one of the largest newspapers in the UK. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II appointed him as a member of the House of Lords. Lord Finkelstein, or Daniel as he prefers to be called, received a great deal of acclaim for his 2023 book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, which was described by reviewers as the best book published this year and a modern classic. It was released in the U.S. as Two Roads Home and tells the story of his remarkable European ancestors who lived through the Holocaust. These relatives included his grandfather Alfred, who interacted with Hermann Göring and sounded the alarm about anti-Jewish culture in Germany as early as the 1910s, as well as Daniel's extraordinary parents. His mother Mirjam survived the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp, while his father Ludwik faced starvation and bitter cold in one of Stalin's labor camps in Siberia. I found Daniel's life story and book to be extremely fascinating, and during a trip to the UK in 2025, I sat down with him for an interview at the headquarters of the Chelsea Football Club, of which he is a director. Well, Daniel, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the History Bites YouTube channel. I appreciated when we first talked about a year ago when you did an interview for a book I wrote on Alan Dershowitz. I appreciated the fact that when I called you Lord Finkelstein, which is, I think, your correct title, you instantly corrected me and said, no, Daniel. Your friends call you Danny, is that right?
Yeah, lots of them, yeah.
Cool. So I know formal title is Lord Finkelstein, but I'll call you Daniel, which I'm very happy to. So Daniel, you've worked for British prime ministers. I know John Major in one case, who was a prominent conservative prime minister in the 1990s.
Yes.
That's right?
1990 to 97.
Yes, and he also worked as an advisor to William Hague, who was the leader of the Conservative Party. Right. Did he ever become prime minister?
No, he was foreign secretary in a later government. So I also was very close colleagues of George Osborne and David Cameron. And in that government, when George Osborne was the Chancellor of the Exchequer and David Cameron was the Prime Minister, William Hague was the Foreign Secretary.
So can you, for those of us Americans who may not be as familiar with British politics, can you give us a little overview of your time working specifically for John Major, what position you held, what historical events the administration faced?
Absolutely. Look, I joined that government in 1995. I became the director of the Conservative Research Department. So strictly speaking, I was working on the party side. In Britain, we have government positions which can be political but are attached to the civil service. And then we also have party positions. I suppose that you also have that in the United States, where you have people who work for the Republican National Committee and people who might work in the administration. So I was working on the political side, but we were coming up to an election in 1995 for John, and therefore at that time, obviously the people who work for the party become increasingly significant. And by the time I joined, the Conservative Party was in a lot of trouble. Except one of my theories of politics really is that an awful lot is to do with the time that's elapsed since you first came into office. By that point, Margaret Thatcher had fallen, been replaced by John Major. We were approaching a general election where the Conservative Party, if it won, would have moved from being 18 years in power to being maybe 22, 23 years in power. 18 years was unprecedented. 22, would have been obviously, far in advance of anything that happened in the modern era. I think Pitt, the younger, may have been prime minister for a little bit longer than 18 years, but not many people. So, or a period that spanned more than 18 years. Right. So I was brought in at that point, and we were already in a lot of trouble. There was also a fair degree of tension in the party, which often happens when political parties are arguing what ought to be the next step. And John Major was clearly a different person, both temperamentally and to a certain extent politically, to Margaret Thatcher. And she had kind of justly been a very loved political figure among Conservatives. It was quite hard to be the replacement for her. John also had his own ideas, probably wanted to fight that election closer to the centre. that aligned well with my disposition, but not, I think, with a lot of people in the parties. And in any case, Tony Blair competed successfully for that territory. It was very difficult to break him down, and ultimately went down to a very big defeat in '97.
I've learned a little bit about John Major's government. I'm working on a book on J.K. Rowling right now, and it's often repeated in her story that she came from Portugal, where she was living and had a disastrous marriage, and then came back to the UK at a time when, and I'm not sure if this is accurate, but it's skewed, or it's been reported in certain books, articles, that she came back to the UK late 1993 under a John Major government that was not sympathetic to single mothers, people on welfare. That was the stereotype I've heard, and you hear the same criticism about Margaret Thatcher. I mean, gosh, I saw videos where people, when she died, were singing "Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead," and it's so I again, as an American, I'm not terribly familiar with the history and the controversies.
So look, there's an overall tension between people who believe, and I think I do fundamentally believe this myself, that the driving forces of society are enterprising people who are kind of making money for themselves and for the community, and it's important to provide for everyone, but the best way that you can do that is making sure the economy grows. That means you have to empower those people who are propelling that growth, and that means that you have to keep a correct balance between the amount of money you spend collectively and the amount of money you allow people to keep for themselves, in order to make sure you have incentives for people to make that money in the first place. And I in that argument, I generally belong to that more conservative side of the argument. And Margaret Thatcher very much made and won on that argument in 1979. And by the time you got to 1990, as often happens over a period of time, public sympathies swing back somewhat. So there was a feeling by the time John took over, are we spending enough money on the National Health Service? Are we spending enough money on public services? On top of that was ladled another issue, which also in the United States at around that time, so when you had the convention which George H.W. Bush finally lost on, after he won the convention, he won the election, but on the election that he then finally lost to Bill Clinton, you had a big argument about the role that culture and marriage and the family played, and again, conservatives were keen to if they're keen to encourage a society in which fewer people live on benefits and fewer people end up, reliant on the state for their income, you want to encourage, and this is what the Conservative Party thought at the time, and I actually thought that too. You want to encourage, marriages to be stable and supported. So a lot of the rhetoric was about that. I've come to the conclusion that politically, this will never work with people. They don't want to be lectured about their lives. They don't want to feel as though a government, often consisting of people who've themselves been divorced or have had affairs, like humans do, is lecturing them about how they should live their lives.
Right.
And in addition, obviously, you have this tension which you often have in benefits. So you have some people who are reliant on benefit income, and their children are reliant on benefit income. And as a compassionate human being, you want to ensure they've got that wherewithal. At the same time, you don't want to encourage everyone to be on benefits.
Sure.
Right? So you've got this tension. Do you do what you naturally have the warm impulse to do, which is make sure those people have got everything they need, but then you think, well, hang on a minute, am I encouraging a trend in society which actually ultimately is not in their interests? And that played out in public, I think, that kind of very uncomfortable debate. I'm not sure ever I know what the right solution is between we have this debate at the moment. It's a perfect example of this. In Britain, we have a limit which was introduced by the last Conservative government, by George Osborne actually, where you don't receive child benefit beyond 2 children. And obviously there are families with more than 2 children, and often those families are not well off, and they're not receiving more benefit, and they've got a lot more costs. Now, on the one hand, it's a source of poverty to those people not to receive the extra benefit.
Right.
On the other hand, you don't want to be saying people who are not on benefit, the state isn't going to help you. If you are on benefits, we're not going to give you benefits beyond we are going to give you benefits however many children you have. So people feel aggrieved if they don't require those benefits, and they feel aggrieved if they don't receive them. They do have them, if that's all making sense, slightly garbled version of it. But you constantly have this problem with all benefits between helping the people who are on them,
right,
and encouraging a trend of behaviour which is unhelpful. And it's natural, society's quite churned up about that, and I often am myself. It's not a simple argument, right? You know, I never want to see anybody go without an extra pound. On the other hand, I don't also want society to structure itself in such a way as to draw more and more people into the benefit system and fewer people working, and that is a natural tension, and that came out, maybe the way the Conservative Party phrased it wasn't the best, or maybe it was simply those are really, really hard arguments.
Sure. Some of the tough questions you have to face as a politician, and at that time, you were in politics, but I mean, you became a politician right when you became a member of the House of Lords, which is somewhat, though not completely, equivalent to the United States Senate. It's the second body of the legislature, but totally different in how you're selected, and
so
obviously the length of time. Yes,
I'll explain a little bit about that. Yeah. So first of all, at that time I was a full-time political operator. So whether you call that a politician or not, but I was a full-time political advisor for a number of years. And after that, naturally, I retained a lot of political contacts and a lot of political interest. And I then went into writing newspaper columns, writing editorials for the Times newspaper.
Yes.
But I retained my political network, and often I would express a view either in the paper or to them privately, which might have influenced or might not have influenced their action. But that's the position it was. And in 2013, as a result of that, David Cameron, who was looking to appoint people he thought were sympathetic to his brand of conservatism, chose me among one of the people to recommend to be in the House of Lords. The House of Lords isn't quite like the Senate. So the Senate is, the elected senior body in Congress. And you have substantially more status and power as the senator for a state than you might do as one of the Congress people, one of the representatives, unless you maybe are the Speaker or the Majority Whip. But if you are a senator, you're generally considered the senior in that relationship. Right. And that's not the case with the House of Lords. The House of Lords is effectively an advisory body. So correctly, because it's not elected, if a bill is passing through the House of Commons, it will go to the House of Lords to review, and the House of Lords will not usually adjudicate on the principle. It's what's called the second reading. They'll have a debate about it, but it will not vote. But where the House of Lords does vote is on individual detailed items in that bill. Let's say, for example, there was a parliamentary recall bill, and it said there would be petitions in each constituency, and there only needed to be 4. The House of Lords might go, that's too few, right? And it will then send that bill back to the House of Commons and say, fine with the bill, but we think it should be 10. And the House of Commons is in a position to go, no, 4. Or, as if it doesn't mind, it might say, okay, 8. Right? And that's the relationship. So if the House of Commons rejects what the House of Lords says, the most the House of Lords can ever do is delay the bill. It can't actually turn it over. In the end, all the power really resides with the Commons, because the House of Lords is not elected. So it's a valuable body, and because the government wants to get its legislation through expeditiously, it doesn't want that delay, and it gives the Lords some say, some leverage, some power, but it is exercised with a lot of restraint.
Right. Is that delaying tactic ever used to achieve some political victory?
Yeah, it's finite. Generally speaking, so if the House of Lords were to pass a whole series of amendments,
Yes.
and we got stuck on one, and that one, the House of Commons says absolutely not, and the House of Lords were insistent. Let's say that theoretically happened. You would then get a delay, and the House of Commons would introduce the bill, but the second time would reintroduce the bill. But the second time, the House of Lords would lose all the amendments from the beginning. The bill would go through as it was originally conceived. So the House of Commons has a power as well as the Lords, and the Lords' delaying power is finite. But here's, you'll have noticed I used a lot of ifs, and the reason is the House of Lords has not done that, right? Generally speaking, if the House of Commons were to reject a Lords amendment twice, the Lords will give in. It will not push it a third time, because there is a respect in the Lords that the Lords has not been elected. The reason why this is significant is that if the Lords was ever abolished, replaced with an elected House, it wouldn't feel that restraint. So at that point, the House of Commons and the House of Lords could get into gridlock. And at the moment, that doesn't happen because the House of Lords will back down. So there are advantages to having a system which is fully elected. Partly, people will find that more easily comprehensible and it's more directly, the individuals are more directly accountable, but there are some disadvantages too.
How often do you meet, like physically go to Westminster Palace to meet in the House of Lords?
The House of Lords during a parliamentary session will meet for 4 days a week. Usually legislative debates only 3 of those days. Quite often the bill will be quite a lot of detail about an item which any given individual may not be an expert in, or they may have other things to do. So it's not a job and it's not an office, but your advice is being sought and you've been summoned there by the monarch officially, so you do go and try and provide that advice when you think that you've got useful advice to offer.
And speaking of the monarch, again, for folks like me who aren't extremely familiar or have any expertise in the British system, a question that I've had and that other friends of mine from America have had is, what role does the monarchy actually play today? And we know it's been vastly different over time.
Yes.
There's evidence all over the UK, especially of the battles in the English Civil War, which was just over this question: how much power should the king and queen have? And then, it was demonstrated quite viscerally by the Parliament what they thought of the extent to which the monarch should have power by King Charles being beheaded, which is a well-known historical event. So,
theoretically, the idea is the king chooses members of parliament to be his advisor, and the reason he chooses members of parliament to be his advisor is because he wishes them to be able to command a majority in parliament to provide him with advice. That is the formal position. In fact, obviously, therefore, the winner of an election who can assemble a majority in parliament becomes prime minister. And the way I've expressed it is merely a form of expression or a convention. In reality, although it's supposed to be the king that makes the decision with these people being merely his advisors, actually, in fact, it really works the other way round. And indeed, let's say, for example, the king were to wish to make a state visit to Holland. The advice of the government will be sought, and the king would not go without it being on the advice of his ministers. So he acts on the advice of his ministers, right? But instead of it just him collecting a load of advice and deciding what to do, the advice of his ministers really means the government tells him what to do. Right. That's actually, in fact, how it works. But in theory, these are the king's. The Parliament makes the king's laws. Parliament is an advisory body that provides advice to the king, and the king chooses the prime minister, and that's the theoretical way but what's happened, the theoretical way it works, but what's happened is the development of a lot of convention. So Conservatives are comfortable with a situation which develops through convention. And the very big difference, we don't have a written constitution, and our arrangements have developed over time. And so, let's say in 1931, the King George V, did play quite a big role in bringing the parties together to form a government in 1931, which was a national government. It's unthinkable that the King now would play such an active role.
Okay. Is the House of Lords, last question on this front, is the House of Lords a rowdy atmosphere like you see the House of Commons be?
No, so it isn't. It's incredibly polite, and as a result, you get much more, I suppose, constructive exchange, and it's much more permissible for a member of the House of Lords to dissent from their own side. In the House of Commons, that comes with a lot of consequences with the whipping system, your future re-election, how you progress through the system. In the House of Lords, it doesn't. You're being put in there in order to provide advice, and I've spoken in dissent of and voted in dissent from my party on numerous occasions.
And it's absolutely breathtaking chamber. I had the privilege of visiting it a few days ago with a friend of mine. I think it's perhaps the most impressive chamber I've seen in all of England. Any room, whether Westminster Abbey or Christ Church Cathedral, it's just absolutely stunning.
That is deliberate. So the House of Parliament burnt down in 1834. They were burning some tally sticks under the House of Lords, actually, and the whole building burnt down. And it was decided to rebuild the building in a Baroque style. So actually, weirdly, it's actually younger than Congress, than Capitol Hill, and I think not than the putting of the dome on, but the building of the building itself. And yet, as you were in there, it's got a Baroque style. Why has it got that style? In order, at a time of, in the 1840s, at a time of political instability, to project the majesty of Parliament, right? One of the things that they did was to make the House of Lords deliberately, which was at that time the most senior chamber, deliberately splendid. And so that is deliberate. It's supposed to produce a sense of awe, and it is an immense privilege to be appointed to that, to be allowed to sit in that chamber. And I'm relieved it doesn't go along with the same kind of political powers that are in the Commons, but it shouldn't fool you as to where power really lies in Westminster. It lies with the executive, and the executive relies on the House of Commons majority to sustain it.
Right. It's amazing, Daniel, and I know you've pointed this out yourself. I've heard it in interviews. It's amazing to think about the fact that you walk into the Palace of Westminster, and 6-7 decades previously your parents were walking into a labor camp in Siberia, walking into a concentration camp in Western Europe. And so that brings us to your fabulous book, Hitler, Stalin, Mom and Dad, which has just received so many accolades. Book of the Year, The Times, Guardian, Financial Times, Economist, a modern classic, says The Observer. Peter Hitchens, by far the best book published this year, and I take it there's many hundreds of thousands of books published every year, so that's an extraordinary compliment. Sunday Times bestseller. Terrific piece of work, epic, moving, and important. And I like this phrase, the grim history of 20th century Europe encapsulated in one extraordinary, ordinary family. Robert Harris. It's a great description, extraordinary.
The thing is, I've really enjoyed writing this book, and it's lovely to publish it. The only thing that's been a problem with it is having to sit still while people are so nice about it, because it's so embarrassing. But I'm really happy to have been able to tell my parents' story, and obviously I think it has a lot of resonance. My mother, you talked about the House of Lords. My mother was still alive when I was put in the House of Lords. She was downstairs in what's called below the bar, so actually in the chamber when I took the oath of allegiance to the Queen. I remember as I was doing that, thinking of her and my father and what they'd been through to come here, and it was profoundly moving.
I'm sure. Mother was Mirjam, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Mirjam.
Her name is, because she was brought up in Western Europe, her name is actually spelled Mirjam, so people did call her Mirjam quite a lot of the time, but it is Mirjam, yeah.
Mirjam and Ludwik. Ludwik Finkelstein.
That's right.
Before we talk about them, just briefly about your grandfather, Alfred. Weiner?
Wiener is how he
Weiner.
pronounces it.
What important contributions did he make? He's not a well-known figure among, I mean, I wasn't aware of him before the book. That doesn't make him not well-known, but I don't think he's
No.
as well-known as a more famous figure. But the work he did, you know, is extraordinary. I know you could spend a whole hour telling us about his work, but are there some highlights of his work that you could give us to have a sense of why he was significant?
Of course, I'll happily explain. So in 1918, he comes back from the First World War. He immediately sees the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany.
Wow, that early.
He wrote a book, or a tract really, in 1919, warning of what will happen if we didn't do anything. And he devotes his career then to that effort. He works for the Jewish organizations. He's giving public meetings everywhere, warning about the libels against Jews. And in 1925, he begins to realize the big danger isn't just the far right, it's specifically Adolf Hitler. And he has an argument in the Jewish community. Other people don't believe him. He shows them the electoral data, and he says, look at where he's winning these places. He's winning support. This is very dangerous. It's agreed that he can begin to keep tabs on what Hitler's doing. So he sets up a secret archive. He collects everything he can of what Hitler's doing. And when the Nazis get to power, despite everything he says and does, he is called to a meeting with Göring. He doesn't know why. Much of it is to discuss what the Jewish community should do, and Alfred was one of the leaders. But as he's leaving, Göring says to him, I know about your archive, which was a secret. You have to destroy it. Well, ultimately, they're forced to do exactly that, but he goes to Holland and starts again. So, and then from 1934 onwards, continuously to this day, he builds an archive of everything that can be known about the Nazis. And this was crucial in Nuremberg when the trials happened. It was crucial in the Eichmann trial as well. And it was very important to something that I think people don't sufficiently appreciate. Even when the war had finished, there wasn't much of an understanding of what the Holocaust was. It hadn't, of course, happened as a label, the Holocaust or the final solution. These are historical discoveries, and Alfred helped with those discoveries. And I'm currently studying the Belsen trial that took place immediately after the death of my grandmother, and I have learned that they did understand that there were gas chambers, and they did understand that people had been brought to Belsen in a terrible condition, but they didn't comprehend why. And actually very few of the witnesses were Jews, because they didn't appreciate that that's really what they were doing, that it was Jews they were aiming at. Alfred always understood that, and his life's work really was make other people understand that. There's still the Wiener Holocaust Library in Russell Square. I'm a patron of it, still working very hard to make people understand that, and keeping all the documents, including the Nuremberg trial documents, for people who want to study them.
What do you think he saw as far back in 1918 that other people didn't see? I mean,
I think he appreciated two things. The first was he had been lots of Jews, and he was one of them, were very proud to serve the German or Austro-Hungarian armies. And they knew that there'd been anti-Semitism in their countries, but they'd seen that there were pogroms in Russia, and the country of pogroms, Russia, was really the country with whom the Austro-Hungarians went to war originally.
In World War I.
In World War I. And so he came back from World War I in 1918, and what he immediately saw, that's why his book's called Towards Pogroms, ? He thought the answer to the question mark was yes, right? Was that Germany he could see that it had embittered his generation. They were looking for excuses. They were looking for reasons why this great army, which had expected victory, had very suddenly, actually, gone from expecting that victory to accepting defeat, and why that happened. And he understood this, whole kind of destruction, this conspiracy theory about why they had lost. And this linked to a conspiracist mindset, which he also detected, and which was linked also to the financial collapse in Germany that took place during the Weimar Republic. And he just saw that would lead to the rise of these far-right extremist movements, and he began to study it. And I suppose from that, when he was studying all the things that they were saying, the more he studied it, the more he realised what they were trying to do and how dangerous it was. Because I'll give you an example of something that happened in the Second World War. Very early on in the Second World War, Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess flies to London, flies to Scotland actually,
Yes.
and he tries to negotiate peace with the Duke of Hamilton, a completely bizarre person to have chosen, right? And he is obviously arrested immediately, and the theory is it's really a peace offering, right? This guy is fed up with Hitler, and he's a moderate, and he doesn't like all this extreme noises from Hitler. He wants to deal. Alfred had read everything that Hess had said. He knew that Hess wasn't a moderate. And because he'd read everything, he was able to put people right about the fact that Hess was in fact a crackpot, which is what he was. So the difference between Alfred and other people after about 1925 is he was simply reading all this stuff,
Right.
when other people weren't. Therefore he knew that the Jews were the target.
Reading minutes of meetings, newspapers.
Yes, he would go around the country with a little suitcase. In it would be a number of copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a critical document. And by the way, later in the 1930s, Alfred sues the publishers, or he is involved in the lawsuit that sues the publishers of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to prove that they're fake. And in fact, the idea was to prove that they were offensive pornography, effectively, in Switzerland. He takes that, he takes various editions of Mein Kampf around, and lots of copies of Die Stürmer. He goes from
Nazi newspaper.
the Nazi newspaper, Die Stürmer, yeah. He'd at an earlier point been involved in a lawsuit against Julius Streicher, who was the editor of Die Stürmer, later hanged at Nuremberg. And this material he tried to use to make people understand what was happening. So, for example, they would do a report on all the cemetery desecrations the Nazis had involved themselves in. But he often, one of the events which was, most dispiriting, he went to see somebody that he knew who was an advisor to von Papen, who was the Chancellor of Germany, who ultimately did the kind of deal with Hitler that brought the minority National Socialists into the government, which they eventually kind of take over. And this advisor says to him, well, thank you for your evidence about these cemetery desecrations. But Hitler's aware of these agitations. I spoke to him yesterday, and he's really against them. He's a decent man, if a little bit excitable, right? That was what they said. So he found difficulty making people comprehend what was in front of his own eyes.
Well, and perhaps that is one of the reasons if people ask the question, how could the Nazis come to power and these things be allowed, is that, and other people have pointed this out, that horrors were brought on not little by little, because things like Kristallnacht weren't little. I mean, it's not, but the horrors were brought on steadily. And you have a quote on page 58 of the book. Civic life for Polish Jews became harder. Attempts to exclude Jews from certain professions, a drive to ban kosher slaughtering, petty legislation which targeted particular types of trading where Jews predominated, such as selling pretzels in the market, and the constant fear that changes to the Constitution might remove the protection of minority rights. Selling pretzels in the market. It's such an absurdly small thing. Do you have a comment on this facet of the Nazi rise, this idea of the horrors being brought about little by little?
Yeah, so first of all, by the way, thank you for citing from the book. For American readers, it's also called Two Roads Home in the United States.
Yes, and there'll be a link below the video.
They might find these points on different pages. So I've come to the conclusion, first of all, that people are dangerously uninterested in democratic norms. You said we talked about Alan Dershowitz, and one of the things that I find compelling about Alan is his interest in the rule of law and how the rule of law works. And that's relatively rare interest, right? I mean, and in his case, it's not professional merely, it's also philosophical. And he finds sometimes people rebel against the times when he uses it in pursuit of unpopular causes, right? But that's the whole point of the rule of law. And a lot of people are much less interested in the rule of law and providing that they're economically satisfied with the government. So they often don't notice when you introduce measures that later you think of as a degradation of democracy. They don't notice it, or if they do notice it, they don't care because it adds to them, and they don't think it's that dangerous to them. And that is a depressing conclusion. But I think it's inevitable. I think what happened in the Second World War did shock people out of that, made them think actually some of this does matter and it might catch up with me, and that is now fading, right? Without, I'm sure this will split those people who are watching this, but I think at Pearl Harbor, the idea that American safety was not linked to whether or not other countries in the world were at war was revealed as obviously untrue.
Sure.
And then Roosevelt was able to get the United States into a war which they'd resisted him getting into before. And I think that Donald Trump's making the same mistake about Ukraine.
Sure. On page 77, I'll be citing a few pages which you pointed out might be different in the American edition. But I had, as I was going through so many quotes, I have dozens and dozens and dozens of pages dog-eared, but in advance of the interview selected just a handful that were particularly interesting to me. Okay, The Office, the Jewish
Central Information Office.
Thank you. Central Information Office, which was headed by your grandfather, Alfred. The office circulated reports to Jewish organizations, human rights pressure groups, journalists and governments worldwide, providing factual information about Nazi activities, speeches by Goebbels, the latest outrageous libel in Der Stürmer, the most recent absurd and poisonous piece of Nazi scientific research on the, quote, alien nature of Jews, and so on. It did so with a minimum of comment, allowing the material to speak for itself. The thing that stood out to me, it says the most recent absurd and poisonous piece of Nazi scientific research on the alien nature of Jews, and so on. How could intelligent people buy into garbage like this? Is it just they know it's garbage and they're choosing to buy into it? I mean, because I know you did a heck of a lot of research for this book.
Yes. So some people aren't intelligent. That's true. The world exists with a variety of people who have intelligence. Sure. Some people who are intelligent find that it serves their purposes to believe in those things. It's amazing what people can bring themselves to believe in when believing in it is useful or convenient. And often believing those things is convenient for somebody's political ends. And then some people didn't notice it was being done at all. So they were simply unaware of these pieces of propaganda, or they ignored them, or they didn't read the source, or they forgot them. In other words, a lot of people go through their lives in which what one person says about another is relatively irrelevant. And all of these things contributed to the calamity that then took place. And then, of course, there were some people who rejected these things but found no means of expressing that rejection. So there are lots of different things. But the interesting thing about that thing that you quoted me was often offered with little comment, right? So my grandfather believed the truth spoke for itself, right? He believed in the power of the truth. And I think if you look back at it, he had some point, because the truth did ultimately prove powerful at Nuremberg, in the Eichmann trials, in historical accounts. But it didn't prove powerful before calamity was visited on every Jew on earth. So its power was limited. And sometimes, in addition to advancing the truth, you also have to arm yourself with weaponry, for example. Right. Which I think is one of the reasons why, my grandfather was not a Zionist who didn't believe in the state of Israel, but one of the reasons why I do, and he did after the war.
That's a fascinating topic. It's a story little told, often denied, and even now to most people entirely unknown. Ludwik's story is one that history has half hidden. Ludwik being your father, who was taken to labor camps in the Soviet Union. It's all interesting to me, but it says, Ludwig's story is one that history has half hidden. It's a story that's often denied. And you made the point at the end of the book that it was the Soviets who were trying the Nazis for the exact same crimes that they committed. That's not, I mean, it has dawned on me as I've studied history. You learn about Stalin as another bad figure of history, but I mean, did that shock you to learn about the fact that the Soviets, in essence, got away with the same or similar crimes as the Nazis did?
Well, I'm less surprised by the conclusion of my book because I wrote it.
Yes.
So, no, it didn't surprise me because my dad always talked about it. But nevertheless, as I studied it, it certainly didn't diminish in impact, and I learned a lot more about why it happened. The Soviets, so for those viewers who don't know, in 1939, when the Germans invade the Soviet Union, the Germans invade Poland from one end, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the other end. And my father was in the part that they had secretly agreed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would be under the Soviet command and influence. And he becomes shortly a citizen of Soviet Ukraine. That is what happens. And therefore under the Soviet Ukrainian so-called law. They deported hundreds of thousands of Poles, possibly more than 1 million Poles, to either imprisoned them in gulags like my grandfather, charged them with crimes, or sent them for indefinite periods to live in the so-called interior. In other words, in my father's case, on a collective farm in northern Kazakhstan. They were theoretically free people, just without any freedom to do anything, and that included eat, because there was nothing to eat there. The idea was you were supposed to kind of work for your food because you were on a farm, but in fact, these farms were incredibly ineffective and inefficient. There was hardly any food in them. So even if you did work, and the amount of work that my grandmother, who'd been a bridge-playing socialite before the war, could do on a farm was necessarily limited. Even if you did that work, you couldn't really eat because there wasn't anything to eat. Ultimately, they survived only because they were able to receive parcels from their remaining relatives back in Polish Lvov, or what had become Ukrainian Lviv.
You mentioned the collectivist farms, which were a scheme of communism. Why didn't they work?
Well, there were a number of reasons. So let's make provide the most generous explanations. First.
Yes,
right?
sure.
These places were one of the reasons why Stalin wanted to send people to these farms, was to create populations in areas where very few people lived. They had very few people to sell each other. They had to sell to. They had terrible weather, so it was not. These were not great farming conditions. They could only work part of the year, and so therefore it was hard to make an economic venture work. That's one reason. Secondly, obviously, the Soviet Union then later was at war with
Japanese?
the Allies and Japanese, but with Germany and with Japan. At that early point in the war, they were engaged in trying to pacify the rest of Poland. So some resources went to that. But the real answer to why these places were less successful, even than these terrible conditions would have made them, is because people had been forced to work on them. They didn't own anything that they made. They had no incentive to work because you didn't do any better if you worked than if you didn't work. So who's going to be the fool that works, right? These kind of very low levels of food, you survived because you just had about enough energy from the food that it became more than you were expending. So therefore you couldn't work very much, and otherwise you'd end up on a sort of downward spiral in which you were working and losing energy faster than you could gain it. So these places were a disaster from the beginning. They collectivized the farms. People tried to keep their own grain, their own animals. There were inspectors from, young people from the Communist Party who'd go around. You might get shot for having tried to keep it. They would confiscate what you were trying to keep and send that to Moscow. And the people who were involved starved. And by this point, it was less than the earlier, 10 years earlier, there'd been this massive starvation. This was simply terrible hunger. My grandmother called it an island of hunger and death. And from disease and hunger and without any medical attention, people simply died. So my grandmother had built a kind of cow dung hut of her own, with her own hands, and you can imagine what a construction that was. And of that, one of the inhabitants, in her late 20s, she got a stomach ailment, diarrhea, and she dies because there's no medical attention.
Yes, in terrible pain every day. I remember her. Yeah. It goes without saying, it's awful to read about. It's, the book is not so unpleasant that you can't make it through, but there was one reviewer who said there are moments where you're so shocked that you put it down in horror. And I put it down in horror not just because it's hard to think about, but also because, and this is said a lot, I'm sure, but it's hard to imagine that it really happened and that real people went through it. Yeah. But one of the things that was breathtaking to me was your grandmother, paternal grandmother, Lusha, even in the midst of the cow dung hut in Siberia, was still trying to educate her son. And I'm smiling because the resilience and the concern and the values that permeated her actions to teach, if I remember correctly, to teach him the Iliad and poetry. Well, there's a blizzard coming through outside, and they're having to go to a pond and walk a mile to get their water that's frozen on the way it comes back, and it's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
And it's inspiring. That's what it is. It's inspiring to me to continue my education, to promote education, and that's one of the reasons History Bites exists. And education was so important to her that she didn't think it was stupid or a waste of time and resources and energy to continue to educate him, even in the midst of that.
It's incredible.
Harsh circumstance.
And if I can get across to you what's so extraordinary about this is my granny, right? And she lived round the corner from my house, and went shopping in the Express Dairy, and gave me pocket money. And she is this incredible person, right? When I wrote this book, I realised that my granny was amazing. Right? And that she'd been also the subject of these unbelievable forces that had all borne down on the family. There's another character in the book, my mother, whom I knew as Betty from Nottingham, right? My mother, a relation
Yes.
of my mother. I thought she was a relation. In fact, she was my mother's nanny when she was a kid, or the au pair girl, effectively. And she does this incredible thing of escaping out of a Nazi Gestapo window. Unbelievable things. She tries 3 escapes from the Nazis, right? And does escape from the Gestapo. And
works as a double agent.
Completely is part of the resistance. So it's extraordinary to read about these people, and it's difficult to explain to you how ordinary Betty was in my life, right? It's only as I grew up, and my granny's stories, which were always very amusing, she would tell these stories, I realized, oh my goodness, it was part of this gigantic tragedy, and also the resilience involved. I knew about her teaching my dad German because my dad spoke German, and I found out how, right? But did I understand at that age, young age, what she'd been through to do that? She really was just a very nice person who gave me extra food, and when I came round, and
Right.
I went round to her house for French lessons, and used to basically evolve into her giving me some food, extra snacks, and watching television, and and so for me that's who she was. But then when I read about what she did, it was really extraordinary.
It's humbling, not to sound corny, but There's a quote from C.S. Lewis, who's very much a beloved member or former member of the British Isles, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, who said there are no ordinary people. And that sounds a little corny, but your book shows that there's an element of truth in that.
Completely. They went back to, so they were,
Yes.
Of course, my paternal grandfathers and my grandmother, they were very wealthy and
Yes.
Resourceful people
It
before.
must have been very difficult.
But they were effectively perfectly ordinary people before the war and perfectly ordinary people after the war. And you read what they did when they did it, and you think, well, that is extraordinary. And that's why, Robert Harris very kindly calls them extraordinary, ordinary family. I think that's actually quite a good description. But I think you're right when you say it's the extraordinariness of ordinary people, and possibly this is in all of us. Some of us would end up crumpling completely, and other people wouldn't.
And some of us would be unlucky enough to be one of those people shot randomly.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think your grandmother saw in education that was significant enough for her to, because there's almost, and this isn't meant to mock it at all, there's almost something absurd about putting energy into educating your child when they're famished and most certainly soon to die, and people are human skeletons around you. There's almost something ridiculous about it.
You think a number of things. First of all, it speaks of the centrality that my father, their only child, played in my grandparents' life, right? So this was how they were going, and this is a very big driving force in mankind, passing your genes on through your children.
Yes.
Right? It may even be the purpose of life, and that's what and so first of all, it speaks about that. But I think it also shows my grandmother was absolutely determined that she and Ludwik would survive, and she probably deep down believed, without any real reason to believe, that my grandfather was alive as well, that they would then one day resume their life. I think they thought it would be in Lwów, back in Poland, which it wasn't. But she believed they had a future, and I think that's a very important cause of her survival and of her actions. And if you believe that, then of course, it was vital that you have an education or not lose that period. Education plays a very interesting role. So it's very important to my grandmother. In the other part of the story, my mother's story, her sister Ruth is devastated because she's losing her education while she has to work the potato fields near the concentration camp on a neighbouring farm who who had hired or given the Jews to work their land. And the extraordinary thing about that is she is perfectly happy to do this work because it's a distraction and otherwise she'd be bored, but she feels appalled that she is just at the age when she would get schooling and she didn't get it. And this is not a retrospective memory because it's in the correspondence at the time.
Yes.
And so I know that it was something she felt very keenly while she was there.
The stimulation of education must have been something you missed when you're doing 16-hour mindless shifts of working with potatoes. I mean, but not just physiological stimulation, but a sense of purpose, of meaning, of drive, of significance.
Completely.
It goes without saying that you have absolutely no significance, or you do have significance, but it's not significance as a human being, it's significance as a number.
Absolutely.
And to get to the people who were behind this, one of the sections that was sobering to me, you give this anecdote. Towards the end of November 1941, an invitation went out to representatives of the major government departments of the Third Reich. There was to be a meeting in a grand Berlin villa by a lake. There would be representation, too, from the Nazi Party organization and the SS. And afterwards, there would be a buffet. 2 months later, the meeting took place. On a snowy Tuesday morning in January, 15 people gathered around a table under the chairmanship of Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the German security police. They were an educated, cultivated group, and also young, many under the age of 40, with higher degrees. The formal proceedings lasted an hour and a half, during which the group agreed to murder all the Jews of Europe. Then they had lunch. Did we all learn, if we study even a little bit of history, you grow up knowing that the Nazis were megalomaniacal psychopaths? Or was there anything that shocked you about the psychology of the Nazis or the Soviets as you researched this book?
Yes, and actually, I'm thinking of making it the subject of another book. So I'm looking at the moment at the Belsen trial, the trial that took place of the people who effectively killed my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and who were arrested when we liberated Belsen, who'd been in Auschwitz and in Belsen. And what strikes you immediately when you read the transcript of that trial was how pathetic their excuses are for what they do, right? How lacking in real introspection and argument they were, and how little they're prepared to explain or excuse themselves. And what's interesting about that the Wannsee conference, which that section describes, is that immediately they decide to do this. They, in all the documentation, they described it as evacuation to the east. I wonder whether they even did that in the discussion itself. They're planning to kill all the Jews of Europe, but they're sufficiently aware of how horrendous that is. They don't even want to say it or commit to it on paper. And so a lot of these people did things they kind of knew were wrong, and they never ever tried to justify them, just justify it. But they all gave each other permission to do it. It's it's in many ways a very puzzling form of action. And that was, I'm still thinking about it a lot.
And terrifying. I know there's sections of the book, many, many pages devoted to this, but could you give us a snapshot of what life was like for your mother in Belsen? And we've already spoken of the labor camp in Siberia. So, what would your mother have seen?
Yes.
And so experienced in Belsen.
To explain, the Nazis' program of evacuation to the east basically meant sending people to the gas chambers. They went to one of two places. They went to Auschwitz, where people were divided. Some people were immediately gassed, and some people were put to work. Often they'd be worked to death, and some of those people survived. We call those, quite a lot of the people who survived will have survived Auschwitz in some form. And then the other place they were sent to, which is where my great aunt was sent, was a place called Sobibor. And in that place, the average lifespan of a Jew was 3 hours. The reason that people haven't heard of it is because almost nobody was put to work there, and almost nobody was allowed out once you arrived there. So 18 people, I think, were sent elsewhere, but everyone else, 3 hours, they were killed. And so very little is therefore known about Sobibor, just because of the proportion of people that died going to it. This happened every Tuesday from the original transit camp of Westerbork. My mother, however, didn't go to Auschwitz, and she didn't go to Sobibor. She went to Belsen. Belsen was a camp created by Himmler to house people he thought would be hostages. And the Germans would get back either money, or they would get military equipment, or they would get people who were Germans who were in Allied occupied countries in return for these people as a swap. And so they took to this place anyone who had any exchange value. My mother's exchange value was that they had falsely obtained Paraguayan papers. And a number of people had. These papers were not forged so much, but they were bought from somebody who falsely issued them.
The passports from the government of Paraguay.
Yes, but issued in Switzerland by an honorary consul who was a Swiss man who was being paid. And
Who took bribes?
He had a legitimate stamp, and these were legitimately stamped, but they falsely said that my mother was Paraguayan. And as a result, they went to Belsen. Now, the idea of Belsen was that these Jews would be kept, they would not be tattooed, they wouldn't be put into uniforms, and they would ultimately be swapped. Himmler thought 10,000 people would be swapped. Right from the beginning, it was a very frightening atmosphere in Belsen, very bleak, very cold, and with very little food. But things got steadily worse. The Allies did not want to do this swap. More and more people were moved from other camps who closed down towards Belsen. They went on these famous death marches, so those people who couldn't keep up were shot. And more and more people arrive in Belsen. One of the people who arrives in Belsen nearly dying is Anne Frank and her sister Margot, who were family known to my family. So they in fact, my mother's sister notes down that Margot and Anne have been seen. And gradually this strain on the camp turns what was already a calamity into a total disaster, and people become iller and iller. Typhus becomes endemic, and the days in which my mother's sister notes down that they had no food increase. She had kept a diary with one line on each page, and the reason why I'm telling you all this detail is you asked what my mother remembers, and the answer is actually that my mother remembers a blankness about it and a bleakness about it. She was very young, and she says there was almost nothing to do, and you sat around basically waiting for everyone to come back, but also you couldn't do very much because you had almost no energy, because you had no food. Then the main thing that people began to do in Belsen was to die. They got thinner and thinner and died. By the time the British liberate Belsen, my mother is no longer there. So they leave at the end of January 1945, and in the middle of April 1945 arrive the British Army to a scene of complete horror. They even called it the horror camp. And people are basically, they were too weak to bury the corpses. There were too many corpses. They were heaped everywhere. There was dysentery and diarrhea in every person. The smell in the camp was appalling from the rotting corpses. My mother caught some of that, but fortunately for them, they were not in right at the end. And she always said to me, I missed the worst bit, which I laughed at when I realised how terrible her own experience had been. But now that I've been studying that, I understand what she meant, why she said that.
A question my father had after learning a little bit about your parents' story was, did your parents live with what would be an understandable melancholy demeanor the rest of their life? Or was it the opposite? I have a friend, his name's Tibor Spitz. He's going to be 96 this year. He was, I think, 14 years old in Czechoslovakia when the Gestapo actively began looking to kill him and his family, and they hid in a forest for 300 days, made a secluded shelter on a hillside underneath a tree. Once in a while, one of them would come out, cover their tracks in the snow to make sure they weren't followed, pick some berries, come back into the hole, and they survived for 300 days. Tibor is just about the nicest person you can meet. The first time I ever met him, he gave me a big hug. He didn't have a clue who I was. His catchphrase, he has a couple catchphrases. One of them is, smile, just keep smiling. And if, don't cry over spilled milk, bring a cat. And make lemons out of lemonade. But anyway, what were your parents?
Yeah, much more at that end of the spectrum. So unquestionably, for some people, it was very hard to get beyond this, and they understandably saw this, the repetition of this episode in everything that they encountered. My parents chose to see it in nothing. They felt nothing was like that. so they wouldn't have an argument with someone about a hedge, or disapprove of one of their children's relationships, or quit the synagogue council over in a furious row about the shape of the Hamantaschen. They just didn't do those things because they felt nothing was like their experiences. In fact, I remember the only time I ever really got in trouble with them once was I once made a comment about being starving before dinner, and my mum explained to me what starving was. I think that's a stance that's to do with your character, it's a little bit to do with your experience, and it's to do with how you decide you are going to deal with it and what you want to live with. But the one thing that my parents were judgmental about people who didn't respond like that. My mother understood completely why that was, and that was up to them, and she was very supportive and indulgent of that, but it wasn't how she was going to live her life.
What do you think gave them the strength of character to not become just utterly pessimistic?
So it's interesting. I think it was a little bit each other, weirdly. So they had these two different experiences, and they met each other, and because they were not the same, because for example, my father spoke Polish to his mum, but my mother couldn't speak Polish, so they all had to speak English. They ended up deciding to forge together an identity in Britain that was forward-looking rather than the last remnants of a continental culture that had been killed. And I think that was critical. I think quite consciously they decided they were not going to be victims, and my mother was very determined that though she was a survivor and she was willing to speak about her experiences, was keen to do that and was pleased to be invited to do that. She didn't see that as all of her identity. She said, I'm a teacher and a mother and a person first, and only then a survivor.
So some final, well, we've already had some big life philosophical questions, but you could probably give a long answer to this. Growing up, what did you learn about life from your extraordinary parents? I mean, is there anything that stands out to you? I mean, I have values that I can point to right away that my parents passed on to me. What were some
They're scattered things. The first thing is, I learned what happens if you stop being kind and concerned about individuals, and the motivating force in my life is to try to be nice to other people. I realize that you can't always do that, and you sometimes also, you make intellectual mistakes, which may mean you support things that don't turn out well or whatever it is, but nevertheless, I try my hardest to be a pleasure to be with and to be empathetic to other people, and I think my parents did teach me that.
Yes. This has been a nice time. So,
and they felt that it was, they felt that at the fundamental level, one of the things that my mother, I think, did struggle with was less why did the very big things happen than why did individual people act in this unkind way. And why would you do that? I think she found that difficult. I often struggle when people behave like that too. So that was that's the first thing. On a more political basis, it's I'm very strongly for the rule of law, and because I know the consequences of it breaking down, on the limitations of power. I'm a little bit skeptical about, I'm more than skeptical. I'm worried when people begin to talk about the voice of the people, and I do actually think that tempering that with some institutional restraints is important.
Sure.
That's definitely part of my makeup, and it's made me a political moderate. And a conservative with a small c. As between support for rash, unworkable schemes and complacency, I would lean in my vice towards the complacency.
Probably an obvious answer here. Do you believe it's important for kids to learn history, and if so, why?
Yeah. So look, there are a number of reasons. First of all, unquestionably, some things can be learned from the history we've discussed today, right?
Yes.
And everyone will have their own conclusions about that but to understand that that's possible, to know what happens when you don't do anything about it, to appreciate those lessons is very important. Secondly, I would argue I've gained a huge amount out of it myself. in terms of simply intellectually and politically, but also in terms of pleasure. You know, I've read the one biography of every Prime Minister there's been in Britain, and my understanding of how British politics operates has been increased, but I also enjoy doing it.
Right.
So I would recommend it to people as a hobby as well.
Yes, as hearing stories, and although the stories in your book are often understandably dark, there are also uplifting moments.
I wanted it to be, you know, you know, people sometimes say to me, I really enjoyed your book, and then they hesitate because they feel that may be a faux pas because of the things that, and it isn't at all. I really want people to enjoy the book.
Yes.
I wrote it in a deliberately readable style, but also, you know, my parents survived the war.
Yes.
In the end, the victory was theirs, and so both at the beginning and at the end, I make it clear, and hopefully there's a degree of humour and lightness about their story as well.
And it's more PG-13 instead of R-rated. How do you handle suffering and adversity?
I've been so lucky in my life, really, and I think it would be like lacking in self-awareness to think I'd suffered any real adversity. I told you that story about starvation earlier,
yes.
and that my mother was annoyed because she thought it showed a lack of proportion, I think. You know, truthfully, I've never, you know, Chelsea have lost twice recently against Brighton, and that was like awful.
Yes, yes.
But
And we're here, for people who don't know, we're here at the stadium of the Chelsea Football Club, quite a popular sport here.
It is. But that hardly constitutes the sort of adversity I've written about in that book. So the interesting question was, how would I handle it? And the answer is, I don't know. You know, I think my parents didn't have much choice about what happened to them, and you don't really know until it happens. So my proposal is not to try to test that.
Right. Well, and even what you said, there's an interesting point to be made in that what you're willing to call suffering or adversity, or what your parents would call suffering or adversity, is obviously very different than what little old me would call it in everyday life. And that's a good perspective for me to have. What are you most thankful for?
I'm incredibly thankful my family came here. You know, to Britain, there is a kind of feeling abroad at the moment. I mean, you know, around about, you know, this country is terrible, it's all failing and everything. And I read my parents' story, I think most people don't know what terrible is, right? We live in an amazing country, right? It's stable, it is relatively crime-free. That's not that it is crime-free, but it's relatively so. It is pretty prosperous by the standards of history, and it's also peaceable as a country. Those are incredible assets, and we have something amazing, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't strive to improve it or be dissatisfied with political efforts to improve it, but it does introduce a sense of proportion. So I'm very grateful that I've had a chance to live in this country.
Yes.
And I always make this joke. I just did a radio comedy show, and I said this, that, you know, my mother was in Boston and my father was in Siberia, but Pinner is nicer. Pinner's the suburb where I live. So I'm grateful about that. And then I'm grateful I had a lovely family, and I have great family relationships. After my parents died, both of them sadly, I'm left with my siblings. I adore them. So we've got a very close-knit family, and I'm very grateful that we managed to come through the experiences of my parents to end up with, you know, the experience I've had in this country. I also have, by the way, you know, absolutely beloved relations in the United States as well.
What I would say, what is the best piece of advice you've received? But if that's too hard, what's the best, maybe not specific phrase of advice you've ever received, but greatest life lesson you've ever received, if you can think of one that stands out? Or
there's so many different things, but I think my, you know, when my mother used to have this favourite joke, which is, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the theatre?
Yes.
Right? And the reason why she thought this was a funny joke was because she found people lacking a sense of proportion ridiculous. Right? And I think that way of looking at things, where I try as far as possible to get things into some sort of proportion, is the most important piece of advice or piece of advice that, or way of living your life that I've ever received in terms of my relationships with other people.
There's a last question. People talk a lot about every human life having intrinsic worth and value, especially from a religious perspective. You hear phrases like imago Dei, being made in the image of God. Do you believe human life has intrinsic worth? And if so, on what grounds? And then as a corollary to that is that something that your parents imparted to you? I know that might be, that's a very deep question, but I don't know if it's one that you've considered.
Yeah, look, I tell you, let me turn around in a way that may not be exactly what you want,
Yes.
you were asking, but it's certainly
Sure.
how I feel it, because it alludes to something I said earlier to you. I think every individual has their own perspectives, they have their own interests, they have their own life, and I try as far as I possibly can to get inside the head of other people and understand where they're coming from, to understand their perspective, to see why they think what they're thinking. And so, somebody said to me as a kind of joke at my expense, you just like everyone, Danny, right? And that's not completely true, but it's a reasonable joke at my expense, right? And the reason it is because I do see this diverse world. There's a lot of people having everyone thinks they're right about everything. Everyone is concerned about their own interests, sees the world from their own perspective. And I'm trying really hard to accept and see that myself. And to feel everybody else has a kind of the right to, not the right, but everyone else should be, as far as I can, afforded the opportunity to enjoy themselves and have a good life as I'm having, and I want to do what I can while I'm in contact with them and insofar as I have a relationship with them to make their life better rather than worse. I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's the way I feel.
I'm sure that motivates the work you do in the House of Lords, and that there's practical ways to do that.
By the way, and it's really important to understand that there are some people who'd be listening to this who are not very fond of my politics, who think that the very things that I argue for achieve exactly the opposite, right? So some of those people may even think my political views are evil, which I was recall, because I certainly don't think that of myself. I do get it. You make decisions and have outlooks, and not everyone can always agree with them, but I do try at least. And
Right.
you can't please all the people all the time, I guess.
And I suppose there's practical ways of trying to put yourself in someone else's position, one by simply stopping before you speak and spending some time meditating or thinking before you answer. The Bible says think before you speak, and reading books like this one.
Absolutely.
So,
What do you mean, like this one?
this one
This
and
one.
others.
Okay.
This one and part.
The others are obviously less important, but that one.
They're not Book of the Year according to Peter Hitchens and the Sunday Times bestseller.
Exactly.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you very much for asking me to do this. I really
Pleasant
enjoyed
interview, sobering, but important, and it's great to connect with you.
it. You too.
Thank you.
All the best.